In this video, I'm going to show you how to install Craft CMS 3 locally using Lando. Now, if you prefer to read, I do have a blog post that covers basically the same information that I show in this video. So what is Lando? If we head over to their website, well, actually their tagline doesn't really, at least to me, speak too much as to what Lando does. So I'm going to take the liberty of trying my own stab at summarizing Lando. And so I've rewritten their tagline as this. For me, Lando is a one-click cross-platform tool that simplifies using Docker for local development. Oh, and it's also open source with good documentation. So let's break that down. So one click. I'm going to compare that to the tool that we were using before for local development, which was Laravel Homestead. So with Laravel Homestead, there are a handful of moving parts that you need to manage. For example, you have to have Vagrant installed. You have to use virtualization software like VMware or VirtualBox or Parallels. Then you have the Homestead scripts themselves, and then you have to modify your local host file. But with Lando, you basically click here on Get Lando, then come here and click on Download, and that will take you to the releases page where you can go and look for the one that's with the green label. That would be their most recent stable release. We can see the next benefit of Lando, and that is that it's cross-platform. In our case, we're a Mac shop, so I would download the Mac version, but you can also see there's the IXE for Windows. Well, Windows 10 Pro, because you do need the Hyper-V. That's only available in Windows 10 Pro, but that's a requirement of just regular Docker. And then you also have installers for Linux. Though if you're running Linux locally, then I think you have enough skills to be able to just run vanilla Docker without the need of Lando. But in our case, I was looking for something that would make it easy for either a contractor or a client developer who needed to set up a project locally. And we could say, okay, you just go, download this installer, and you're basically halfway there to getting your project installed. All right, then the next part, I said, simplifies using Docker for local development. Well, Docker has a fairly steep learning curve. You have to learn how to write a Docker file, how to build images, how to manage containers, how to configure storage, how to network and bridge containers. So yeah, depending on your server skills, learning Docker could take a couple of days to weeks, especially when you need to customize a tech stack per project. So we're an agency, we're working with different clients, and one client, their production server could be on a fairly recent tech stacks. It was like PHP 7.2, MariaDB 10.1. Well, another project could be running some legacy app that they're not going to update anytime soon, if ever. That's still running on PHP 5.6 with MySQL 5.6 and so forth. So you get the idea. So in order to be able to customize a project like that in Docker, you need to learn to really work with Docker well. But Lando abstracts all that for you. Basically, you only work with two things, a Lando command and a Lando config file. So if you scroll down here on their website, you'll get an example of the Lando command, and you're going to basically use that to start, stop, destroy Lando apps. And here we're seeing it initializing a Lando app, and we're going to go through that. And then the Lando config. In the Lando config, you see here an example. And what the Lando config file is, it's a .lando YAML actually, which defines your project's tech stack. So as I mentioned before, the version of PHP, the database version, and even tooling like Node and Grunt and any external libraries that you need installed. In this example here, you'll see this very simple Lando YAML file that only has two lines, the name of the app and another line that says recipe, WordPress. Well, Lando has a concept of recipes, and since Lando does come to us from the Drupal community, you'll see different recipes for Drupal. We've got recipes for Laravel. We've got recipes for WordPress. And for example, what the WordPress recipe means is that it's going to install the most recent version of PHP, the most recent version of Apache, and MySQL. Well, at least in terms of what Lando thinks is the most recent version. Like right now, it'd be 7.3, I believe. There's no Craft CMS specific recipe, but we're going to use the LAMP recipe. If we scroll down again here, we keep going down a little further, we're going to see that right here, that not only can you use Lando to run different PHP projects, but really Python projects. Here we see Django, Ruby projects like Rails, or even just JavaScript projects. So it's a cross-platform and cross-framework tool that you really could use for all your projects. All right, and if you come back to the top, and I said it's for local development. So you may have heard that Docker you can use to ship your containers to production. Well, no, Lando is not that case. They make it very specific documentation that this is a development tool. It's to mimic your local environment as close to possible as your project's production environment. They say here, think of it as a local development, dependency management, and automation tool. And then as you can see, if they do have good documentation, and it is an open source project, so it's free, no licensing fees. Anyway, enough backstory. Let's get started. So as I already showed before, in order to get Lando, you would go over to the releases page and download the installer for your OS. I already have the Lando package here, so I'm going to run this and walk through the installation of the Lando Mac installer. All right, so click here and then, okay. So one thing is that Lando does come with Docker Desktop pre-installed. So it is a one-click installation, but if you've been working with Docker and you already have a version of Docker Desktop installed, it's important to keep in mind that Lando will overwrite that version. So if you have anything there, you just back up any database, so forth, because Lando does install its own version of Docker Desktop. Basically the version that they use to compile this release of Lando. All right, it's finally done installing. You can close that out. So this is what you're going to run into with Catalina. You're going to run into some permissions questions. So I'm going to say okay, and then we can move the installer to the trash. Now, a couple of things that I would suggest is come here to the Docker Desktop, and under the preferences, I would disable this part where it says automatically check for updates. Because again, since Lando does ship with its own version of Docker Desktop specific for that release, if you do update past the version that Lando was expecting, then you might run into issues. And then also I would come into the resource section, adjust to give it a bit more, basically as much as your system can handle. So in my case, I am running a quad core CPU, so I'm giving it all 4 CPUs. I have 16 gigs of RAM, so I'm going to give it 6 gigs of RAM, which might be pushing it out. I'm not sure. It seems to be running pretty good. The more RAM you have in your computer, the more you want to give to Docker Desktop. I've set the swap file to 4 gigs, and I've increased the disk image size to 104. All right, so now we're ready to start the installation of Craft CMS. So I'm going to go make a project. All right, so here I'm in just a code folder. It could be your whatever it is specific for your projects, and I'm going to make a directory for a project we're going to call Play Until Dawn. Then I'm going to cd into that. And now I'm going to run Lando init. And that'll basically fire up kind of like a wizard. And so I'm going to say, yep, I want to put this Lando project into the current working directory. Then it's going to ask me, do I want to use a recipe and what recipe? I'm going to say, yeah, I'll stick with the lamp recipe. Web root for Craft, it's web. And then it'll ask you for what name do you want to give your Lando app, and I'm going to call it Play Until Dawn. All right. So here it gives you a summary of the information for your project. I'm going to open up this in Sublime, and we see that it created a Lando YAML. And basically that's what we have here. So this is the Lando config, the Lando YAML for this project. We're using the lamp recipe, and the web root is at web, and so forth. I actually don't like the hyphens in the name. I'm just going to leave it all together. Now let's actually start this Lando app. So we come here, we can start it with Lando start. And this will go through the process of downloading and installing the different containers for this project, depending on your internet speed and, again, the resources of your system. The start time varies. I've noticed that, at least in my system, the database container does take a while to start up. All the containers finally started. Lando, by default, creates some URLs for you to use. Let's explore some of the other Lando commands. So if we just run Lando, it'll show us what other commands are available. The ones that you most commonly use would be start and stop. There's this other one here that you see power off. Basically, it means shut down all Lando containers, because you can run more than one Lando app at a time, though really depending on your local system's resources, that could be taxing. Let's see, Composer, primarily working with PHP projects. That is another one that I tend to use a lot. Lando Composer. There's also logs if you need to see any logs in your system. So let's see what this Lando info command does. If I do Lando info, well, it gives us information of the project, right? And we can see here that the version of MySQL that we're using is 5.7, and the version of PHP that we're using is 7.3. And here are the default credentials that Lando sets up for us. So basically, whatever the name of the recipe is, like lamp, or WordPress, something along those lines. So let's compare the version of PHP that I have installed locally, which I mean on my Mac. So if I do PHP-V, we'll see that I have PHP 7.3.11. And if I do Lando PHP, which is now going into the Lando container, it returns 7.3.16. So it's a little more recent than the one that I do have installed locally on my Mac. Similarly, if I do Lando MySQL, so I was able to connect to MySQL 5.7. All right, so now I could just do exit now. But I actually don't want to use MySQL. I prefer to use MariaDB. And in this case, I do want to run the latest and greatest version of PHP, which is PHP 7.4. So the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to go here to the Lando YAML, and under webroot, I'm going to write another key here, and I'm going to tell it that I want it to run PHP 7.4, and also that the database, I want it to be MariaDB 10.3. And I'll save the Lando YAML, and then hop back over here to terminal, and I'm actually do Lando destroy. So that will destroy the current app and associated containers. And now I'm going to do a Lando start again. All right, so it finally spun up, and let's confirm that the changes that I made did indeed take. So if I do Lando info, here we see that this is PHP 7.4 and that version of 10.3 of MariaDB. And again, just to check it specifically, there we go, PHP 7.4. And then if we do Lando MySQL, we'll see that we're connected to MariaDB 10.3. All right, here we still have these credentials for the database that just say lamp. And that's not very useful in my case. Again, we work with different projects, and when I export this database, I'd rather have it have a name that's more easy to identify than just lamp. But luckily, you can define that. So back in the Lando YAML, I'm going to add a new section. It's going to be at the same level as the config key. And I'm just going to drop this in. Basically, we have this services section, which we start overriding some of the services. So in this case, for the database, yep, MariaDB 10.3, I'm sending a port forward. It's going to make it easier for me to connect to the database in the container with my local database client. And then here is where I am setting the credentials for this database. You'll notice that I am setting it to the default username and password for Homestead, just because sometimes I do want to switch out between Lando or Homestead, and I don't want to change those credentials in the .env config file for Craft. All right, so if we go back to command line, I'm going to do a Lando destroy once more. And then Lando start once more. All right, the Lando containers finally spun up again. And now I want to confirm that those credentials did get overridden. And here we see that, yep, there's the database name, the password, the Homestead user, and notice that the external port is set to 3320. So a word on this external port, basically, I keep track in spreadsheet which ports I've already used for different projects. And so that way I'm not using the same port for different projects. All right, so we're finally ready to install Craft, and we're going to do so by using the composer provided by Lando. So we are going to run the following: Lando composer, Craft CMS, Craft. Oops, wait, I forgot. Create project Lando Composer. Create project. And then I'm actually going to put this inside of a boot folder. And the reason that I'm doing that is because Composer cannot install a project inside a directory that already contains files. So in this case, we had this Lando YAML already inside the Play Until Dawn directory. So I'm just putting them temporarily into this boot folder, and then we're going to move them up. All right, so we can see that Craft has installed, but the Craft files are inside that boot folder. So we need to move those up. So I'll just do that by running that, and that moved almost all the files, except we also need these dot files, and we can do that by this. And so now that boot folder is empty and we can delete it. All right, so now the next step is we need to define the database credentials in here in this .env. So the first thing we need to set up is this dbdsn, and if we look at Craft documentation, we're going to see that this is the format that DSN needs to be. All right, so I'm just going to put that in there. And so in this case, the host is actually a database. So you might be used to seeing that as local host, but in this case, it is database. And that is because of the way that Lando defines that connection. The port is the standard port that we use for MySQL or MariaDB. And then the DB name, as we can see here, is what I called it, Play Until Dawn. The DB user, well, I set it up as Homestead, and the password is secret. Save that. And now we can visit up a little bit. If you forget what the URL is for your project, again, we can just do Lando info, and this is the one that we're going to use. And it's going to give you an error because Craft has not been installed yet. And the way you install is by going to admin and install. All right, I can click the big red install Craft button. We accept the licensing, and now we're going to create the admin account. So in this case, I'm just going to put a very secure admin username. I'll just put Alex and then password there. Next. All right. If you made it to this screen, then you're golden. It means that your database credentials in the .env are correct. If you instead see a screen asking your database credentials, then double check the .env. All right. So for this one, just call it Play Until Dawn, and that is fine for the base URL. And then I'll click finish up. All right, and here we go. We have Craft CMS 3 running locally using Lando. If we go to, for example, utilities, and we take a look at the system reporting, here we go, PHP 7.4. All right, you may notice that here my URLs are running securely. So it is running TLS or SSL or HTTPS locally. There is one step I didn't show you in the video, and it's basically you need to come over to the Lando documentation that talks about SSL and TLS and run the appropriate command for your OS. So in Mac, it's running this line. And then I do run Firefox. And so for Firefox, there's an additional config that you need to change so that Firefox also accepts the Lando certificates. All right, once we're done working with a project, I already showed you Lando stop. All right, and that will spin down the containers for this project. But if I run, this is just a Docker command, I see that there is one Lando container still running. Well, if we do Lando power off, that will completely shut down all Lando containers. All right, so is Lando the perfect local development tool? Well, no. I'll admit sometimes those containers do get into kind of a weird state where the easiest solution for me has just been to do a Lando destroy and a Lando start just to get everything spun up again in a clean state. The other main complaint that I've seen about Lando is that it's slow. Again, I'm on MacBook Pro 2017. Once it does start, it runs pretty well. Definitely not as fast as vanilla Docker, but the trade-off simplicity for me in terms of getting a site up and running locally on a new machine with the tech stack that project needs, the tooling and so forth, it's worth it. Another downside is that since Lando is being maintained, you do have to wait for them to add support for new releases. Kind of another nitpicky gripe on my end is that I would like to have a way to customize these local vanity URLs like you can do with Level Homestead or Valet, but that's a really minor thing. But again, the benefit for me in being able to standardize our local development and being able to have someone new git clone and run Lando start and having the tech stack and tooling installed is very powerful. Enough so that I do want them to improve, and so I am sponsoring Lando. This is worth it enough for me that I want them to be able to make this better. And so thanks to everyone at Lando for making my local DevOps much easier. All right, so to close out this video, I do want to show you one one final thing, and that's how you can connect to a local database tool, in my case, SQL Pro. I've already set up a connection. The trickiest part here is that before I did mention that you had to use database for the host, but in this case, the host, you do set it to 127.0.0.1, and then the rest is homestead secret, and then the port, the same port defined as the port to forward to. As long as the database container is running, we can see that we can connect, and it's a 10.3 MariaDB database. All right, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video, and we'll try out Lando for your own local web development.